In the scriptures, God often uses relationships to illustrate spiritual points. For example, he often uses the father-son relationship, like in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18, where he takes the throne promise to David, and he applies it to us and says, I will be a father to you, and you will be sons and daughters to me. And he makes a point about our relationship with them. You remember, of course, the parable of Jesus, parable of the prodigal son, another one of those famous parables or teachings in Scripture where the illustration is being drawn from a father-son relationship. God also uses husband-wife relationship to describe and to teach things. He talks to us a little bit about the church and the relationship between the husband and wife. He uses the husband and wife relationship to talk to us about the church, and to his relationship with the church to talk about our relationships as husbands and wives. And who could forget the Old Testament illustration of Hosea, who was asked by God to marry a woman named Gomer, who was a prostitute, and God uses the relationship between between Hosea and Gomer to illustrate his relationship with Israel, who has become unfaithful to him. There are also many times where Scripture uses agricultural or farming relationships or illustrations. You can't forget about Jesus telling the parable of the sower and the planter, the man who goes out to plant seeds, and how that describes the kinds of hearts into which the words of God fall. And then there is kind of one of the songs that we sang today about I am the vine and you are the branches. And that's based on John chapter 15, verses 1 through 8, Jesus teaching there about his father, him being the vine, and his father being the vine dresser. And we're all really tied into him in that vine. So the point that I'm getting at is, if we read our Bibles, we realize that God often uses these kinds of things to make points. And so it shouldn't surprise us when we go to the book of Isaiah, for example, and find that he does exactly the same kinds of things. He makes a point in chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, about the relationship between he and Israel, or he and Israel and Judah as sons that have become unfaithful. He uses the marriage relationship in chapter 1, verse 21, where he talks about Israel becoming an unfaithful wife. And we also see Isaiah using the vine dresser illustration, the illustration of a vine and the branches, and vine and branches and that sort of thing. We see that very clearly in the text that Norm just read for us from Isaiah chapter 5. It's sometimes described as Isaiah's Song of the Vineyard. And this is a very interesting text, because what God does in this text through Isaiah is he talks about his relationship with people of Judah particularly, and he describes them as this vine or vineyard that he plants. And the vineyard, the vine dresser, who is God, ultimately we find out in the text, he works extensively to raise what he believes is going to be a fruitful vineyard. He puts it on choice property, choice piece of land. He, as we read about it, he builds a hedge around it to protect it. He turns up the dirt very loosely, gets the dirt good and loose, and rids the dirt of all stones and things like that. And he plants this vineyard very, very carefully. And he does other things that make it clear that the vine dresser is expecting a good produce or good product from the vineyard. And to his disappointment, to his dismay, it only produces worthless grapes. It's a disappointing kind of thing. What should he do with this kind of vine or vineyard? And he tells us what he ultimately will do. He was going to abandon it. He was basically going to let it just be run over and become ruined. He was going to take down the hedge. He was going to call the rain not to rain on it anymore. And he was basically just going to let it be destroyed. He was going to let it waste away. And in the text, it's clear that God is using this parable, this story of the vine dresser and his vineyard, he's using it to talk about Judah. It's very clear from verse 7 that he's talking about the men of Judah as the delightful plant. He talks about them in verse 4 as the inhabitants of Jerusalem and of Judea. He talks about them, or of Judah, excuse me. He makes it clear later on in the text that he's talking about in chapter 14, or verse 14, that he's talking about Jerusalem. And so he is saying that I planted the nation of Judah, and I intended them to be a very fruitful vineyard, a very productive vineyard, but they have turned out to be worthless and disappointing. And there's a kind of a wordplay that God uses that we don't really catch if we don't read the Hebrew text. And I'm not good with my Hebrew, so please bear with me as I try to share with you this wordplay. But it's interesting that in verse 7, he says, "Thus he looked for justice, behold bloodshed." He wanted to find justice among his people, but he found bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but behold, a cry of dismay. And there's actually a word play, as I'm mentioning, in this particular text, because the word justice is the word mishpat, but the word bloodshed is the word mishpah. I looked for mishpat, justice, but behold, mishpah, bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, tzedakah, but behold, a cry of distress, tzedakah. And so there's a very close similarity between these words, and God is trying to help us. If we were reading the language, we would hear this wordplay, which would just accentuate his disappointment. I wanted my people to be filled with justice, and they were full of bloodshed. I wanted my people to be full of righteousness, and they were just dismay, cry of dismay. And what follows then in Isaiah chapter 5 is a series of 6 woes that are pronounced on the wicked. And what these 6 woes do is they help us understand the kinds of people that have become his people, the kinds of things the wicked among his people are doing, the things that have led him to be so disappointed, so dissatisfied, so dismayed about his people. And I recognize that this passage is applied to a specific people, that he's actually talking about the people of Judah, that way in which they had become. And Isaiah is sent to them to try to call them back to God, to try to help them see what's going to come if they don't repent. In fact, he's saying they haven't repented, and this is what's going to happen because they haven't repented. And so I'm very well aware that what he describes here are the sins of an ancient nation of Judah, and the desolation and the pronouncement of justice or judgment that's coming on this people is about that specific people. So I understand that. Don't get me wrong. But I will tell you, as I read the record of their sins, I'm terrified by what I read, because of how much it sounds like modern America. Maybe we would say the entire world, but certainly I believe it describes the way we in modern America are. And that frightens me. Look at the 6 woes. The first woe is found in verses 8 through 10. He says, "Woe to those who add house to house and join field to field until there is no more room. so that you have to live alone in the midst of the land. In my ears, the Lord of hosts has sworn, surely many houses shall become desolate, even great and fine ones, without occupants. For 10 acres of vineyard will yield only one bath of wine, and a homer of seed will yield but one ephah of grain. What he's describing here is a penchant for materialism. He's describing Judah as a nation of people who are accumulating property after property, leaving less and less for others, taking more and more for themselves, and becoming so isolated because they have such big spreads of property that they're almost all by themselves. You know, when your property extends so far, you're ultimately cut off from everybody else by the distance between you and your neighbor. And it's yours. It's your property. There's a real sense in which you're all by yourself. Now, that may not sound exactly like America, but we sure as a nation are all about amassing more and more property, more and more stuff, more and more material things. And that drive that moves us, the materialistic mindset that moves us to just want more and more stuff, is a mindset that feeds selfishness and greed. And these are problems that are in our nation. Don't recognize the selfishness of many of our people in our world. And the nation around us. We're not being very objective. We're not looking at things very well. There's just a whole selfish thing that goes on in our world. It looks like a problem that we as Americans have. And I will just say to you that this problem hurt Judah. And it will hurt us Americans too. It is not that having things is wrong. It is not that having property is a bad thing. But God doesn't bless us with this property. He doesn't bless us with these things so that we can just hoard them to ourselves and keep them to ourselves and amass more and more of them. He gives us those things that we might share and help others and use those things to bless our world. Judah hadn't done that. And I fear that that's the way we're becoming in America. For Judah, the consequences would be that all of their property would be unproductive, that it would yield just a pittance of what it potentially could yield. And so despite their wealth and all their possessions, they were still going to go lacking. And how is it that we sometimes, no matter how much we have, still feel like we don't have enough? It's kind of frightening. I know he's talking about Judah. I understand that. But doesn't it sound at least a little bit like us? Think about this next woe in verses 11 through 17. Woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may pursue strong drink, who stay up late in the evening that wine may inflame them. Their banquets are accompanied by lyre and harp and tambourine and flute and by wine. And they do not pay attention to the deeds of the Lord, nor do they consider the work of his hands. Therefore, my people go into exile for lack of knowledge, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its throat and opened its mouth without measure, and Jerusalem's splendor, her multitude, her den of revelry and jubilant within her, descend into it. So the common man will be humbled, and the man of importance abased. The eyes of the proud will be abased. But the Lord of hosts will be exalted in judgment, and the holy God will show himself holy in righteousness. Then the lambs will graze in their pasture, and messengers will eat in the waste places of the wealthy. Oftentimes, with great wealth comes a great pursuit of pleasure. And that's what's being described here. We have a word in English that is the word hedonism. And oftentimes it comes from a Greek word that is used actually in the New Testament that is described or translated pleasures. And someone who is a hedonist is someone whose principal purpose in life is the pursuit of pleasure. And that's where Judah had gotten to. That they had a party spirit, that they were just all about fun, all about entertainment, and lavishing upon themselves more and more luxuries and more entertainment in the mad pursuit of fun. Has there ever been a nation, well, maybe Judah, but has there never been a nation covered up in luxuries and so given to the selfish pursuit of entertainment like America? Have you tried to find a decent movie lately? It takes longer to find a decent movie than it takes to watch the silly movie. Because there are so many choices, and many of which are not movies you want to watch. Okay? And I can't believe how many movies there are out there. And I think to myself, how in the world do we afford to make this many movies? Because people want them. People are after them. Think about computer games. I mean, we've moved away from the days where we were going to the ball game all the time and it's all about sports, and there's still a lot of that going on. But there's so much now that's done in our own home on our computers. How many computer games are there? I'm kind of technically challenged, as you know. Fortunately, my little flip phone doesn't do all that stuff, but I got a computer at home. I don't dare do the computer games because I'm sure I'll mess something up. But the point is, I understand that there are just hundreds and hundreds of games that you can play. And I'm amazed that there are people who play games all the time. How much time is spent playing computers? You know what I found out? Okay, I'm a little slow, I get it. But I found out that you can actually make a living playing games on computers. I don't understand that. Just so much of that going on, so much of that. It's all about that. And how much time do we spend playing games? How much time do Americans spend playing? Are we that far behind the description of Judah? I fear that we may have surpassed Judah in our pursuit, pleasure, and sin. And all the while, and here's the big deal too about that, it's not that it's wrong to have a little distraction from time to time. It's not wrong to play a computer game or to do something fun. That's not anything wrong with that. But the problem is that so much of the time, just like Judah, what Judah was doing, they were so madly in the pursuit of pleasure that they do not pay attention to the deeds of the Lord, and they do not consider the word of his saints. They're so involved with games, with entertainment, with the pursuit of pleasure, Judah was, that they didn't have time to think about God and what God did and what God was doing. And that's really the big problem for us with some of these things. Not that the thing itself, the entertainment or the pleasure in itself necessarily, certainly there are some pursuits of pleasure that are in and of themselves immoral, don't get me wrong. But you can pursue numbers of pleasures that are wholesome, but the problem is we get to going after them so much that we don't even remember to think about God, what he's doing. Pursue pleasure And all the while we ignore God and all that he's done for us. Oh, yeah. In tragedy, we'll turn to God. Fly a couple of planes into the World Trade Center, and suddenly we'll become very prayerful. Now, I know that dates me a little bit. But that was like 23 years ago that happened. Many of you may have been kids. Some of you may not have been born then. When our Trade Center planes were flown into the Trade Center and it was destroyed. And I remember, because I lived it, I remember how our nation suddenly turned back to God and were crying out to him. Some getting mad at him for letting it even happen, as if he should have protected us. But we were ignoring him. I'm not saying he let that, or he did that, he caused that to happen. I'm not saying that at all. But my point is that only time we really sort of get serious about turning to God is when suddenly we're facing a tragedy. And then many times we're not turning to him for help, we're turning to him for someone to blame for the problem. Yeah, that was Judah. The consequences of Judah were horrible, because God was about to bring upon them a brutal captivity from the Babylonians. And my thought is, could that happen to us? The third woe is in verses 18 and 19. Woe to those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood, and sin as if with cart ropes. Why do they say, let me start again. Woe to those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood, and sin as if with cart ropes, who say, let him make speed, let him hasten his work, that we may see it, and let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come to pass, that we may know it. This is describing those folks who practice sin after sin after sin because they saw no evidence of God, no work of God came to in their view, they felt there was no danger. Respect for God, even belief in God, is at an all-time low in our nation, I'm feared. People today boldly do things that once were commonly seen as shameful by all of us, immoral, by most of us at least. And that's often because, the reason that that's happening is because often most people either think God is too good or too indifferent to punish, or they think that there is no God to punish at all. That's what Judah was doing here. And Judah would find out differently, and so will we. The fourth woe, verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. What's being described here as a complete inversion of moral standards. Those things which one time were said to be good are now said to be evil. Those things that were said to be evil are now said to be good. And that's what Judah was doing. They called evil good and good evil. I will tell you that never in my lifetime have I seen such a total inversion of ethical values as I've seen in America today and in our world today. Today, it doesn't make, to use an old expression of my good friend Ray Ferris, this doesn't make good nonsense to me, but today we have the same ones who passionately and aggressively advocate for the protection of iguana eggs also advocate for the reproductive rights, their reproductive rights to kill their own babies. And just a few years ago, Americans were horrified to learn that African nations were practicing circumcision on their young girls. But now we advocate for a child's right to have radical gender-altering surgery. Today, I am considered an immoral bigot because I oppose same-sex marriage and advocate for biblical marriage. But please understand that as I oppose same-sex marriage, I oppose all kinds of marriage that are contrary to God's law. I think that we got all worried about the sanctity of marriage, and we were upset about that, and suddenly getting all upset about that, and we'd already opened the door for that when we started a marriage or divorce for every reason, and adultery that follows. We'd already opened the door for that when we were okay with our kids moving in with each other, living together before and without marriage. And please understand that I care deeply about those kinds of folks. I want desperately to help people. I know what it is to be broken. I know saint in the way we sometimes use the word saint. Thanks be to God that He has made me a saint. I don't know how that happens. I wonder at the mercy of God that allows that. But I was not a good person. I'm not thrilled to talk about it, especially in front of my grandkids. But I know what it's like to be broken. And so who am I to be self-righteous in my opposition to these things? I'm not doing that. But these are sins. These are things that separate people from God, that cause us to be broken, that make us even more broken. And it's because I want to help people that I want to say to them, please, think differently about what your choices are. Please understand that your Creator has created things for our good and in our best interest. Let's listen to Him and do it His way. That's what we try to do. But we're so ingrained in a world which is inverted right now. The fifth woe in verse 21. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. This describes those who are arrogant, prideful, and smug, and who think themselves to be so wise and so clever. The people of Judah were so arrogant that they were surely pulling the wool over God's eyes. They just knew that God was not seeing, that God did not care, that they were getting away with their sin. And in the words of Romans 1 and verse 22, they were professing themselves to be wise, but they themselves were fools. Doesn't that describe smug Americans who redefine their sinful conduct so that we redefine our sinful conduct so that we put down in shame those who are actually doing good things? We think that we can do these wrong things and get away with it, that somehow God can be mocked. But Galatians chapter 6 teaches us that God is not mocked, that whatever a man sows, he will also reap. And I want to help people who are covered up in that kind of thing. And the sixth woe in verse 22 and 23. Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the rights of the ones who are in the right. Here we have the description of those who use alcohol to position themselves for a bribe so that they can lie to help the wicked deprive the innocent of their rights. Does that happen in America? Sure it does. I know that God isn't talking about America in this passage. I know that, okay? But it doesn't sound that much different than what I see in my world today. And that is unnerving to me. And I'll tell you why it's unnerving to me. Because history proves that Judah did indeed suffer all the consequences that God had predicted. We've already read verses 13 through 16, but read with me verses 24 through 30. Therefore, as a tongue of fire consumes stubble and dry grass collapses into the flame, so their root will become like rot, and their blossom blow away as dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts, and deprived the word of the Holy One of Israel. On this account, the anger of the Lord has burned against his people. He has stretched out his hand against them and struck them down. And the mountains quake, and their corpses lay like refuse in the middle of the streets. For all of this, his anger is not spent, for his hand is still stretched out. He will also lift up a standard to the distant nation, and will whistle for it from the ends of the earth. And behold, it will come with speed swiftly. No one in it is weary or stumbles. None slumbers or sleeps, nor is the belt of its waist undone, nor is its sandal strap broken. Its arrows are sharp, and all its bows are bent. The hooves of the horses seem like flint, and its chariot wheels like a whirlwind. Its roaring is like a lioness, and its roars like young lions. It growls as it seizes the prey. It carries it off with no one to deliver. And it will growl over it in that day, like the roaring of the sea. If one looks to the land, behold, there is darkness and distress. Even the light is darkened by its cloud. This text is describing the prediction of the coming of Babylon. God was going to call the Babylonians to come against his people, Judah. And the Babylonians were no wimpy army. They were a well-ordered, well-prepared army. That's what he describes when he says the weary that they would come swiftly, and that the weary, or there's none weary or who slumbers, they're not asleep. These guys are on their toes. They're not relaxing, taking their belt loose. They're not loosening their sandal straps. They're ready to come and do what they're being sent to do. And it's to devastate his people. And it's going to be a time when, just like grass burns and just kind of falls off, and there's nothing left but dust and ashes. That's what's going to happen. The streets are going to be filled with corpses of dead bodies laying there. That's what Isaiah is predicting is coming. Is this Babylonian destruction, because my people are involved in these kinds of, they're a worthless, sinful vineyard. They haven't been what I've asked them to be. And it's not a pretty picture. The throat, as it describes early in the text, the throat of Sheol, the throat of Sheol is open. It just swallow up more and more, and it's just going to be death and destruction and darkness. Gloom. Judah experienced that very destruction. Judah watched, for example, in 722 BC, as their rebellious northern brothers were taken into captivity by the brutal Assyrians. The Assyrians were awful when they came and took the north. But then, as if a warning from God, Judah itself was invaded by Assyria in 701 BC. And again, Assyria was brutal in the way in which they treated the captives. These are pictures of their own records of what they did in the city of Lachish, which is a southern town, a town in southern Judah, or in Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah. Lachish was one of the principal cities, and it was taken by the Assyrians in 701 BC. And you see things like these guys over here impaled through their stomachs on poles. You see things like the guys on the top who are having their skin flayed off of them. You see the guys down here who are having their tongues pulled out. That's the brutal treatment. And these guys that are being treated that way in this picture, according to the Assyrian records, these are the Assyrian records of what they did to the people of Judah. God was warning them, somebody else is coming. And though God spared them due to the good King Hezekiah, Judah ultimately continued to just become more and more wicked and corrupt. And so finally, the nation of Judah was taken into Babylonian captivity in 3 stages, in 606 BC, then 597 BC, and finally in 586, Jerusalem itself fell, and the temple of Jerusalem and the city was completely razed and torn down, destroyed. And for those in this 3rd stage of the Babylonian captivity, it was especially brutal, with famine and sword and agonizing death. Though they lived, their captivity was not horrible as they lived in the captivity. It lasted for 70 years. Now, I know, again, that there are no specific warnings from God about bringing America down to destruction or punishing it in a similar way as it did Judah. I know that they're not that. But listen, people, he who does not learn from history is destined to repeat it. And what I want us to understand is that we are foolish if we think we can behave like Judah and other wicked nations again and get away with it indefinitely. As a nation, America needs to sit up and pay attention. Pay attention to God. Pay attention to his unchanging word and the standard that he calls upon us to live by. We need to sit up and pay attention to history. God is in control. And God sees what's going on in our nation. I don't know how long he will put up with it. I don't know how long he will be patient with us. I have no ideas about that. I don't know if he'll even bring this kind of judgment on us for certain. But we had better learn from history. Because God has proven himself to be the one that sets up nations, and he's the one that brings them down at will. We need to recognize that. History doesn't teach. If history teaches us anything, it teaches us that God is in control of our world. Boy, that was a real good sermon. Everybody feel pumped up, ready to go home and just do what's right? I didn't want to talk to you about these things because I wanted to depress you or to frighten you or to just so you'd go home with kind of a gloom and doom attitude. That's not what I want. But I do want us to see reality. And I want us to see reality so that we can know that there is something we can do to help our nation avoid Judah's fate. Yes, Proverbs 14 and verse 34 says that sin is a disgrace to any people, but the same verse also starts by saying, righteousness exalts a nation. And when that is true, we need to understand that even in our nation, which may be very corrupt, maybe we've suggested it's more corrupt than it actually is. I don't know. Maybe I'm not being as objective as I should be. I don't think I'm far off, though. But I want us to understand that when there are people in the nation who are willing to do what's right, that can make a difference, a positive difference for a nation. And I believe that that's why it's imperative that we prove ourselves to be blameless and innocent and above reproach in a crooked and perverse generation, as Paul describes it in Philippians 2 and verse 15. It is imperative that we are seen as lights in our world, holding fast the word of life. Again, Philippians 2 and verse 16. And that's because we are the light of the world. If we are authentic followers of Jesus, if we're truly disciples of Christ, then that's what we're supposed to be being, is the light of the world, reflecting the light of the ultimate light, Jesus Christ. We're supposed to be reflecting his light to the world. And I believe that if our nation is going to avoid further and further degradation, and maybe even ultimate judgment. I don't know. But the only way that's going to happen is for the people of God to be the people of God. For us, I know we're just a small group, but we can make a difference here by letting our light shine and by being what we're supposed to be as the people of God. And that's what I want you to understand. And that's what I want you to go away with hope about, is that we can be a hope through God. God can use us to help our nation have some hope. If we'll just be people who are the kind of people He wants us to be. And please understand that when I say that we need to be people who stand for what is right and let our light shine and try to be a good influence in the world, I am not saying that we can accomplish that by being self-righteous and that we can be hateful in our speech toward others and that we can look down our nose at those who are broken. Do you not remember when you were broken? I remember when I was broken. And I'm still kind of messed up. I still have issues. Who are we then to be self-righteous about this? We've got to be people who stand for what's right in the way Christ stood for what's right. Christ was someone who showed compassion and pity on those who were broken and lost. And that needs to be what the world sees of us as we shine our light. They don't need to see us standing around being self-righteous and condemning and saying, you terrible, terrible folks, sure wish you as righteous as I am. They don't need to see that. That's not going to help anybody. Because at that moment, you're not being righteous. You're being self-righteous. And I'll tell you something, just so you know, some of the harshest words that Jesus spoke were not aimed at the prostitutes and the drunks and the thieves and the tax collectors. The harshest words he sometimes spoke were toward the religious elite who thought themselves to be the guides of other people. And so I'm appealing to us to turn on our lights, to keep our lights burning, to show forth the light of Christ in the Spirit of Christ. And so those things that we've talked about with regard to how we can communicate better to one another in recent weeks and how we can have better relationships by more open communication with one another, those principles still apply as we communicate to the world. We must be people who are not intimidating. We must be people who are approachable. We must be people who are not prideful. We must be people who are open to helping others. And so when you see someone practicing some sort of sin, don't walk away from them, turn your nose up at them and walk away. See if you can help. And if someone walks in here, and let me just say this to you folks, that the more we are like Christ, and the more we are shining our light like Christ is, the more we're going to have people walk in here, like the gentleman who walked in here on Wednesday night, who came and was drunk and inebriated. We tried to help that man. We didn't validate his wrong behavior. We didn't say it was okay for him to do that. We tried to help him. And yes, we haven't heard anything from him since. I don't know if we ever will. But my point is, we're not going to attract people and help people turn their lives around if we ourselves are like the self-righteous Pharisees. We've got to be people who love people like Jesus loved people. Be the kind of people who will demonstrate a heart of compassion for the broken, remembering how broken we ourselves were once. and how it's only through his grace and mercy that we have been repaired and that we are being renovated according to his image. And yes, that takes time, takes effort. The Lord's been working on me for over 40 years, 45 years technically. And he's still got some work to do. We've got to be able to remember that about ourselves and help people in this way. And I believe, folks, that instead of looking at the condition of our world as doom and gloom, and we certainly need to pay attention to what's happening, but we need to see it as an opportunity to let our light shine. And to shine in a way that's truly reflective of Jesus Christ. That's what we're appealing for. How we communicate to the lost matters. Okay? And maybe, just maybe, if we and our brethren all over the world will let our light shine, maybe we can escape the fate of Judah. I don't know. But we got to be willing to try to help. So don't throw your hands up in despair. Don't get disgusted and mad at the world, because you did your own part in making it ugly. Okay? You made it your own contribution to the sinfulness of this world. Let's do what we can to reach people with the saving gospel of Jesus Christ.